Hello and good evening. My name is Ivan. I'm an anarchist from Belarus, and I'm going to talk to you about uprising against dictatorship from the anarchist perspective. This presentation is done in the frame of the International Week of Solidarity with Anarchist Prisoners, and I will focus a little bit more on that topic today. The presentation itself is full of violence and blood and everything that is connected with state repressions. So if you're triggered by those things, I would recommend not actually listen or go further to the presentation, or at least avoid watching pictures and videos. You are not going to see me today. You are going to see only slides, and hopefully this will be enough for you. The talk will be around 1 hour. If I am not fast enough or slow enough, it can be that it will be a little bit shorter or a little bit longer. Right. So what I'm going to talk today about is a little bit about the protest itself, how it started, why it started, and then about some kind of a critical points or critical analysis of what was happening in those weeks and months after the beginning. And of course, to start, there was some time before the protest, and this is an important part to actually understand how it happened. Nothing is working, like out of the bubble and then appears and then disappears. It's all a complicated political process, complicated political processes that are going on. And I would like to mention the first thing that happened before the protest in 2020 is the COVID pandemic. I think some of you might have heard that Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, was trying to behave as if there was no COVID, so there was no kind of a public services or attention towards COVID or coronavirus. And a lot of people were left on themselves, like the government just abandoned them. And this was quite a big move from Lukashenko's government, because traditionally it was presenting itself like a people's dictatorship that is taking care of the people and stuff. So what happened is the people had to start self-organizing to survive through COVID waves. There was a huge fundraising campaigns that were actually collecting money for basic things for the medical personnel, but also supporting people who are under direct influence of COVID, so got sick and shit like that, or the neighborhood assemblies or neighborhood initiatives that you know from other countries where neighbors would support each other. So all of that was on steroids. So if you know that from the Western countries, there was still a lot of solidarity, not solidarity from the state, but there was still a lot of infrastructure provided from the state. And in Belarus, most of the infrastructure was provided by the people, and people were forced into this self-organizing. And you also have to understand that in Belarus, self-organization was not existing in its base till 2020, and that was one of the important parts of actually consolidating dictatorship. For Lukashenko, it was important to destroy self-organization, to destroy the horizontal connections between the people. And because of the COVID, those connections started reconnecting or rebuilding really fast. And also, of course, together with that self-organization came huge dissatisfaction with the government, with seeing Lukashenko telling people, oh, you have to drink vodka or go to sauna and everything will be fine. This was like a spit in the face of the people who were dying from COVID, who were fighting COVID, and all the people around them who were providing solidarity and kind of like this warmth of the society. So COVID showed for Belarusian people that this myth of the social state, once again, is destroyed. It is not like Belarus was a social state for last 10, 15 years or even 20. There were some remnants of the Soviet times where you would have like a certain benefits in different sectors. But for example, since 2012, IMF came to Belarus giving credits, and one of the credit line was about actually decreasing the benefits to the social sector. So Belarus was cutting all the benefits for quite some time. And I think one of the first protests against those social benefits cuts, or like social infrastructure from the state or welfare state, was in 2007. And since then, like, it just went on and on and on. And also, I think for a lot of people, not only in Belarus, but outside of the country, COVID showed that there is nothing in this world that is permanent. Although the dictatorship was trying to present itself as the ultimate and only solution for all the problems that exist in Belarus, starting from economical and social and, I don't know, political, all those problems were, like, you know, addressed by the dictatorship in the sense of, we are going to take care of you. The big brother, or in case of Belarus, Lukashenko is actually called a father, is going to take care of you. So don't worry, everything will be fine. However, this kind of notion of stability is really weak in the face of crises that they do not understand. And this is our opportunities in many cases to actually bring those authoritarian regimes down while they're struggling to understand what the fuck is going on. The difference between the government and the people is that the government is this slow, really massive tractor or combiner, and we are like this really fast moving and adaptable creatures around it that can actually change the direction of the whole society without combine understanding that it goes into the fucking pit or into the lake. So that was COVID. And what was also important to mention that although Belarus is a dictatorship, Lukashenko in 2020 had quite a strong connections with the EU. This was not traditionally like that. For quite some time, Lukashenko's main connection was with Russia, and Russia was providing most of the money that were supporting the dictatorship. But from 2015, European Union started cooperating actively with Lukashenko. The line there was that Lukashenko is eventually better in the whole situation than the scenario of Maidan, the scenario of war that it was started by Putin, and so on and so forth. So Lukashenko, by the European politicians, was more stable partner than attempts to overthrow the dictatorship and bring some kind of a liberal alternatives to the country. What that meant is, from one side, this kind of decrease of the struggle, of the political struggle within the country, less of attention towards the human right violation, less money to the liberal groups, less money to the NGOs. But on the other side, all of that, apart from political support, because EU was not actually, you know, like saying, oh, Lukashenko is a great thing, but financial support was like just dropped on the Belarusian economy every year, starting from the infrastructures projects like building up roads in the country, and ending up with this bullshit about defending the borders and border regimes. Within those projects, like the Belarusian security forces were getting quite a lot of money, and also apart from money, like drones and expertise and trainings and shit like that, which was like always justified that, you know, to prevent the smuggling of people and illegal sex traffic. So this was happening till 2020, and Lukashenko, because of his kind of connection with the European Union, he was also moving away from Russia. And you can see that in 2020, he was really escalating the situation with Putin and not trying to say, oh, my great brother or whatever. Rather, Lukashenko was saying Belarus is an independent state and we are going to fight for that and we are going to stay independent. We are Belarusians and so on, and all this kind of a semi-nationalist bullshit that came to him because of his attempts to maneuver between Putin and the European Union. And of course, it is really important to mention, before the protests, before all these massive demonstrations, there was a pretty long election campaign that started in May 2020. And election campaign basically was one of the biggest mistakes of Lukashenko, because he decided to make it just in the middle of COVID pandemic. And all this dissatisfaction and self-organization that was happening on the streets that government didn't actually see or prefer to ignore because, well, if they start repressing that, it would bring even more troubles, might be. So all of that, all of this anger was funneled into or tunneled into the election campaign. So beginning from May, it was like a huge mobilization happening on the streets, happening within the society with some kind of a belief that this time the things are going to be different. Lukashenko's government was fast enough to reply, and they arrested several of like prominent politicians and also some of the people on the streets. But in general, the repressive apparatus was trying to be gentle, gentle in the sense of not arresting like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people because of the political situation outside of Belarus. If Lukashenko's government would react and have a lot of violence in the election campaign, then European Union would move away what happened after the protests or during the protests. So Lukashenko was moving really kind of step by step, slowly checking out, and they were arresting the opponents through some provocations, or in one case on corruption case, which was also made up, but they tried to look legit. They didn't like do all the shit that they're doing right now. Rather, at that point, they were trying to make it legit, that there is some kind of a processes happening, and even they created this myth that there are some Russian Wagner soldiers, which is like a private company, sent to Belarus to start a revolution and bring down Lukashenko and build up some new regime that is pro-Putin, clearly, right? So after this wave of repressions, there were certain people still left in the political opposition, and one of those people was Tikhanovskaya, the wife of a famous Sergei Tikhanovsky. At that point, she didn't have any political, let's say, experience or political weight in the society, but she started picking that up really fast. When she got this kind of acknowledgement to become a candidate to the president, it's just like went like a hurricane through the country. A lot of people started organizing around her because her campaign was not about political or economical reforms or something. She was saying, we will just make new elections without Lukashenko and fuck him, and we're going to have new Belarus. This was like appealing to everybody, basically, who didn't like Lukashenko. Doesn't matter which political colors were there. And for her kind of benefit, Lukashenko was and is, and his repression apparatus is extremely sexist. They think that, okay, women cannot actually, pose us any threat. And this was another mistake that was made in the middle of this kind of a political uprising in the country, or political hurricane. They underestimated the possibilities of Tikhanovskaya and her and people around her for quite some time. So for several months, there were things happening, rallies on the streets, demonstrations, and so on and so forth, within some kind of a semi-legal frame, with a little bit of repressions, but really small interest from the government. Only a couple of days before the elections, they figure out, okay, we actually have to stop her. We have to stop her somehow, and then they prevented her big rally, or tried to prevent her rally in Minsk, which was like a joke for most of the people, because their official reason was that there are some renovation work or shit like that. And I think it is also interesting that in that political campaign, amount of people that got mobilized, or in that election campaign, amount of people that got mobilized through the political campaigning was way more, like, I don't know how many times, but there were thousands and thousands of people who were participating in political organizing, in social organizing on the streets, and this kind of like a COVID self-organizing parts were also participating in the political parts to get rid of Lukashenko as their reply to the COVID crisis, that we don't need any more dictatorship, we need some kind of a, sane government, which was, well, a general, like a liberal values that were way more progressive for the Belarusian society than 10 years ago. So what happened in the first days of protests is something that the government, again, didn't understand. So this was another mistake. Traditionally, for Belarusian opposition, the mobilization was happening for the election day to Minsk. So everybody were expected to take the train or bus and come to Minsk and join this huge demonstration without any kind of a plan, but we are all together and maybe we will build up a tent camp like it was in 2005, 2006, or we will, I don't know, do something. So for the government, this kind of traditional scenario was already well known. And what they did is they basically mobilized half of the police population and like this police, military police to Minsk with a lot of trucks and a lot of equipment brought to the capital. But what happened this time is because of the scale of mobilization and also focus of like, it's not about Minsk, it's not about capital, it's about all the country. There were a lot of groups and a lot of people all around the country who were going to the streets and in their own towns. They were not planning to go to Minsk. So the dictatorship also lost that grip. Like they didn't understand that this is going to happen. And on the first night, there were riots all around the country, actually, in big cities like Brest, Grodno, and Minsk. But there were also riots in the smaller towns like Pinsk or, I don't know, like some cities where there were never protests before, but people went on the streets and started from like a peaceful march to escalated resistance on the streets. In some places it was completely successful up to the point that the cops just ran away from the town or they hid somewhere. And in some places the repressions were a little bit more, well, successful. In Minsk it was, for example, really hard to gather, but people managed to in the city center. Without this kind of like 100, 200,000 at the first night, there were maybe like 5, 6, 10,000 people on the streets, which is also quite big for the country, where there are no protests happening on general, like, you know, in Europe or in US or whatever you live in your liberal country. So for Belarus, this was massive. And energy around the country was like tremendous. You know, everybody were preparing for this kind of a momentum that we are going to push and we are going to push hard and we are going to get rid of this dictatorship. I have a couple of videos to present you what was happening on the streets that days to give you a little bit of an atmosphere. There are way more of this kind of documented examples on the internet. So if you're interested to see not like a mythological part of the protest, but really what was happening on the streets, just go online and you will find it on YouTube, in Telegram and shit like that. So this is Minsk, and this is the night after the elections, or evening after the elections and the election polls were closed. And this was police trying to grab the people from the streets so they would have a bus and would jump from that bus and detain a couple of people. And people just started fighting with the cops and de-arresting the people that the cops were trying to take with them. This is a second video from Brest, which is like a smaller town, regional capital, where there were way more serious clashes the first nights with like stones and basically streets fight with the cops, where the cops were losing the streets quite often. course, the government was trying to repress what was happening on the streets. The first kind of a step was, of course, blocking the internet, which is like a traditional thing, or disturbing the internet to prevent organizing on the streets. So they were bringing some attempts to do that, and in some places it was successful. For example, Minsk, most of the city was left without internet. Some kind of a really bizarre blockade, because in some cases internet was actually working, and some of the VPN providers that are like built up around this anti-censorship technologies were able to press through this kind of internet blockade. But in general, the internet was not there. And actually, this is by many people seen as a, let's say, positive side. From one side, we didn't know what was happening on the streets, but on the other side, we had to go to the streets to figure out what is happening. So we had to build up back these social networks that we had in physical world to figure out what was happening, what we are going to do next, what the police is doing, and so on and so forth. And also, and you might have seen pictures and videos, police violence in those first days escalated from this kind of like, oh, we are going to push you with the shields to, or just grab you on the streets, to a full scale, like beating up and just destroying people and killing people literally. There are some pictures that I have from the first day from Minsk where the stun grenades were just shot in the crowds, and people shot with the rubber bullets that were just like some crazy shit that they first time tested and they didn't know what to how to use it. And yeah, so the cops went completely crazy where they were not beaten up. And then the next day, even if they were beaten up and they would go on the streets, they would have even more anger, even more kind of like payback modus. What they were also doing in the first days, the protests were happening in the evening mostly, and they would go during the day to the streets and start like basically terror operations, where they would also, like, I don't know, at 8 in the morning, 10 in the morning, 2 during the day, they would go with their buses without plates or in their like riot vans through the cities and start grabbing people or just beating up people in front of everybody. So this was happening kind of everywhere. And this has also brought this point that these elections are now starting to touch more and more and more people. So when they were arresting some random people on the streets, that means that's going to affect the whole surrounding, starting with the family and ending up with the working circles, so where the person is working at the factories and so on. So that was also one of the reasons why workers started getting up in the first days. First of all, of course, against the violence that was happening on the streets, against the blood that was spilled and was just flowing through the streets, but as well because their colleagues were, coming from the night shift, for example, in the morning, and they would get arrested by the cops because cops thought that they were at the protest and they're coming back home, and they were not. So there was this kind of like, we are not even participating in that protest and we are getting repressed, so we are better going to participate in something, and at least for that getting repressed, and actually fight back for our colleagues than just sit on our asses. So in the first 3 days, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, police managed to arrest 6,000 people. In the first night, it was 1,000 people, the second night, 2,000 people, and the third night, 3,000 people. And this is just unofficial numbers from the police. In reality, we don't know what was happening, how many people were actually arrested. They had their prisons just overfilled. I mean, in the cell, you would have, cell for 5 people, you would have 30 people there, and they wouldn't have a space to, spread their hands, right? They were just standing next to each other without any possibility to move. Also, around 150 or even more than 150 people got hospitalized in the first days in different parts of the country, and at least 5 people killed as a result of repressions in the first days. all of this information was not available for the people for quite some time, apart from amount of the detained. The cops were not actually releasing information or giving the names of the people they detained. So people had to search for their friends, and many thought, okay, my friend is dead because I can't find them in prison or in like detention center and shit like that. And this was like a really hard times for a lot of people. Also about the hospitalization, there was a lot of unclarity because people were brought from the prisons to the hospitals, and there were a lot of rumors that there were even more casualties at that night. And it's still unclear how many people were traumatized or injured in those protests, apart from this kind of official numbers of hospitalized people. What happened on Thursday, after like the barricades and the street fights, was a wave of the escalation of the protests. For a lot of people who saw all that violence, they went on the streets, and they went on the streets in this kind of a demand for peaceful protests, or demand for like possibility for peaceful demonstrations, for peaceful resistance. And this was somehow accepted by the government. So the government went also on de-escalation modus. It was really unclear for Lukashenko government how long they are going to hold this like a violent line, because the whole country was burning. And for the people, it was also unclear. Like for us on the streets, it was really unclear how long we can, keep this modus of every night we are going on the barricades, every night we are going to fight, because there were more and more people arrested, and there was like more and more frustration of what is going on. So peaceful demonstrations took over somehow. And even in the first days, it began into like radical transformation of what is happening on the streets. You would have people who are asking anarchists, please don't come to the demonstrations, or maybe you don't join us with your black bloc, or maybe you don't bring your whatever they were expecting, that we are bringing bazookas, or we are bringing, I don't know, machine guns and tanks and shit. So people were forming up, in Minsk at least, as I'm aware, some kind of a self-defense squads, but self-defense squads not against the police and kind of like resist the police, but rather like search within the crowds some provocators that are going to provoke the police for more violence. So people thought that if we do not provoke the police from Thursday on, the cops are going to go away, and we are going to build up our momentum of a protest, and we show how many we are, and then the Belarusian government will be impressed. And that was a line that was really pushed by a certain liberal analytics and the liberal, let's say, political activists on the internet and also on the streets. Another part that was really annoying, and is still annoying for a lot of people, in August, already like a week later, there were this kind of political analysts who were shouting, "We already won. Everything is done. We just have to wait. Lukashenko is a political corpse because he used so much violence in center of Europe. There is no way that he's going to survive that. Survive in the sense not of hanging on the pole, but rather survive in the political sense. So he will have to withdraw from power, and he will have to, submit to the reforms," which was like a traditional, liberal Western school analysis, where the political reputation actually plays a role in your, let's say, participation in political life. But Lukashenko is not a person who is, really cares about the public opinion. He's a dictator in a more traditional way, and he was building his power for almost, 25 years or 27 years, right? And for him, he used already political violence in the 90s and 2000s. He made his opponents disappear. So he showed that actually applying violence to stop the political movements or to consolidate his power within the state is not a problem for him. But this "we already won" was like repeating and repeating and repeating. And some people in like personal conversations would say, yeah, we should cheer ourselves up and saying we already won. But in reality, the things were, still dynamic. It was unclear who is winning. A lot of cops were running from the police forces, right? But still a lot of cops were believing that they are going to stop this. And when the de-escalation happened for several weeks, it was really harder and harder to push this kind of like a line of, no, we have to confront the government. We have to like start doing proactive things, because this kind of peaceful demonstrations, peaceful Sunday demonstrations that were attracting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people around the country, they were actually not achieving so much a part of showing this kind of like a huge masses present on the streets. And I think this is another kind of like this liberal notion that exists, like a liberal myth that exists and should be like just fucking thrown out of the window, that if we bring a lot of people on the streets, then these people in power that are sitting in palaces will see, oh my goodness, there are so many, I'm going to give them power because they are so dedicated and they are so convinced and they are so peaceful and I respect them so much that I'm going to walk away. Bullshit. So all these hundreds and thousands of people didn't impress Lukashenko, and what they were doing, they were like arresting people step by step in the smaller crowds. And this was like a really successful strategy for them, like not escalating as it was before, but still like doing step-by-step repressions, building up their own power within the, like, let's say, hub or key points of the protests, and destroying the protests in the small decentralized places. And all of that, like the growth of the police power, the growth of the dictatorship power, and decline of this kind of like, okay, we are going to fucking fight back, led to the point that it was at some point pretty impossible to restart this active phase of resistance. There were less people, and there were quite often again confronted by this, please be peaceful, please be non-violent, we are not going to resist and going to throw stones at the police, rather we are going to show that we are many and we are dedicated. And of course what happened is that at some point the government or the dictatorship saw that now they can hit the leftovers of this kind of a bigger protest, and they will be successful. And that's what happened. The repressions escalated, and people were exhausted for the months of the repressions that were happening already, step by step, that were not like in your face, but rather slowly affecting different groups of people, throwing people out of the country, but also putting people in jail. And this brought like this huge exhaustion, basically, of repressions. Also, what happened was, I think, a second or a third wave of COVID hit Belarus. And this was really fucking hard because from one side, you had all this horizontal organization in the first wave. And in the second wave, big part of this, horizontal organizing was busy with the protests. And also big part of it already had to leave the country because of repressions. So people again were left on themselves, on their own. And Lukashenko's government was using COVID to actually like stop the protesters. So if you would have a couple of hundreds of people arrested on Sunday March and thrown into jail, they would be like tossed around in the different cells to increase the amount of the people that they are contacting. And in several cases, they would have like people with COVID, clearly with COVID, and they would bring them to the different cells to spread COVID among other prisoners. And most of the anarchists, or most of the people I know who were in prison, actually had COVID when they got out. And this was also, I don't know, intentional. It seemed to be intentional attempt to use COVID as a kind of a biological repression weapon against the population to stop them from, active resistance even after they're getting out of the prison. Also, before this big escalation, the government already managed to destroy most of the protests around the cities. Instead of going against Minsk, which is like most organized and the place where media newsletters are and people are, spreading the information a little bit faster, they went after smaller towns, then bigger towns. And by the time they were like hitting hard on Minsk, most of the cities were already destroyed, which played an important role in this possibility for the cops to consolidate the power in Minsk and not have protests all around the country as it was happening at the day of elections. So with the repression escalating and less people going to the streets, it came to the point that in December the protests declined. The people who were behind calling for the newer and newer demonstrations said, we are not going to call for new demonstrations. And this was pretty much the point of the big protests. It was seen as an attempt to, let's say, make a break for the protesters, but the break didn't manage to explode at the end of winter or at the beginning of spring. So the protests right now, the big protests right now, are not really happening anymore. I have like a small good bad analysis of what was happening during those days. One of the things to mention is this attempt or a constant need to search for leaders in certain groups. So liberals or organized political liberals would search for sure, like we need new leaders, we need new people who would lead the crowd. This was a little bit exhausting, but also quite easy for the police to repress. So the liberal politicians, but also like liberal media would find new leader, and this leader would get arrested really fast. And this was a constantly repeating circle. There were also certain bizarre power dynamics in self-organized groups where you would have society organized in a clearly vertical level for, I don't know, for almost ever, right? For at least like the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, Belarusian Republic, all of this is like a vertical of power. And there is a little experience of self-organization and kind of like mutual respect. So some of the groups that were building up were built up also on the vertical level, with the people like really taking and enjoying their power in the smaller groups, which was kind of a problem for the certain people who were trying to participate in those groups and have this kind of a dynamic of, let's say, anti-authoritarian organizing. As I mentioned before, this we won already notion was another really bad idea, because we did not. Clearly, we can see right now, we did not. And shouting that we won when the fight is still going on is a really bad idea. You'd rather start like really critically analyzing what you're doing, maybe having a really hard criticism or harsh criticism towards ourselves of what we are doing, rather than through this kind of, oh, we need some optimism in our protest, bring us to this kind of a brink of idiotism where we are attacked, we are under attack from the dictatorship. And there are a lot of people shouting, no, don't resist, we won, they are losing. Another interesting part was that for the protests, there were no clear goals or any abstract goals out there apart from we are going to bring down dictatorship. There was a little understanding of how this process should go on, how we should bring this down, and how we can use this how can we use our hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people strength to bring down the dictatorship. What should be done? Where should we go? Where should we stay? And instead of searching for this kind of like a, let's say, revolutionary process, people just at some point withdrew to this kind of a Sunday marches routine without trying to, okay, what should be done next? What should we do? This was great, but what are our next steps? This was lacking a lot. And because of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people joining, more and more people were demanding some kind of a safe protest forms of if we are so many and we are peaceful, people are not going to get hurt, people are not going to get tortured and things like that. And this was one of the things that was kind of pushed again by the liberal media to achieve, that we have to build up our protest in such a way that is safest for the people. And I think this is something that is kind of a contradiction in itself when you're trying to radically change the society, when you're trying to radically overthrow like a dictatorship, and you're from the other side trying to be in safety. this is impossible. Like, you have to put some risks. You have to put yourself in risks to bring this kind of a massive machine of violence down. And there will be victims and there will be violence on the streets. And this is inevitable. There is no peaceful, nice way to bring down Belarusian dictatorship. And Lukashenko proven this many times. A lot of people were also waiting to be navigated through big marches, although this kind of self-organization was happening on one side. On the other side, the self-organization didn't bring or didn't form up new forms of, let's say, activism or building up any goals for those smaller groups. Rather, the people were waiting for some coordination from the bigger Telegram channels that would tell them, oh, on this day we are going there, on this day we are going to do that. And going after that. So it's like accepting goals from the Telegram channels rather than trying to develop their own strategy step by step or build up their own strategy within this kind of like a bigger destination that was specified by the Telegram channels. Focus on Sunday demonstrations was also not the best idea, but for a lot of people, this was the moment or the demonstrations that are happening with, I mean, the biggest demonstrations in the history of Belarus. Never happened before. And for a lot of people, this was like the main focus where to organize ourselves. This was not the only focus, but for the, let's say, the biggest newslets, the biggest media, the biggest Telegram channels, this was the point where all the energy was poured in. Outside of this organizing with the workers, organizing the women marches and so on and so forth, Sunday demonstrations were the demonstrations to go, the demonstrations to join. Yeah. As for good, I mean, apart from bad, there was always good things. The amount of people who joined this political movement was massive. It is not, you know, your... Sorry. It is not a couple of thousands of people going on the streets and protesting something crucial, right? It is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. By different estimations, 120 to 1/10 of the whole Belarusian population was on the streets. Like, they were not just organizing, they were on the fucking streets. Around that, you would have the whole infrastructure of media, activists, and all this stuff. So this was like a massive movement of up to several million people who were actively participating in the resistance against the dictatorship. This is important because Belarus is a 9.5 million people country. So it is like a massive amount of population throwing their energy together in this kind of like together move to actually destroy the dictatorship. Decentralization of the protest was, I think, the thing for most of us on the streets, because it showed that this governmental bureaucracy and governmental structure is not flexible enough to actually suppress smaller groups all around the country rather than a bigger group in one city. And this was actually one of the reasons why the protests lasted so long, that people didn't try to focus on one place and be like, we are going to be there, rather than disturbing the power all around the country. And this was happening because of the self-organization. People were not waiting for get-together, but rather like getting together with their neighbors and building local structures of resistance. Like the neighborhood assemblies exploded in Minsk and some other cities, and they were not created by some central authority, but rather this was like a push towards self-organization in the places. And this was like a great thing happening, because for Belarus, this was another new form of political organizing, for people to be involved in politics after this many years of being excluded from social and political life. And in general, it was quite a big part of the society that was ready for active resistance. In the first days, as I said, thousands and thousands, dozens of thousands were on the streets. And even though the peaceful, so-called peaceful protest was happening all the time, there were all the time clashes with the police. There were still like smaller groups within this big demonstration that were trying to de-arrest the people. So all of that resistance was still going on, although not in such a concentrated manner. But the amount of people that were actively resisting the government, actively resisting the police, was like thousands and thousands. And this was really impressive because for the fucking cops, this was the first time they got a punch in the face from a normal people. What also started happening at, I think, like 1 month later after the protest started, were those acts of like small groups attacks on the infrastructure, starting with destroying the police cars, destroying the police stations in some places, and also sabotaging the train lines that is like an economical arteria of Belarus, which is still happening in the smaller scale, but at that point it was just massive. People who were not okay to join the Sunday demonstrations, really small amount, they decided, okay, we're going to do something outside of that by ourselves, and this will be like those actions, the direct actions. And the decentralization and self-organization gave this amazing push towards radical perspectives within the society. People started not just, demanding, okay, we need a new president who's going to make everything fine and he or she will be great, rather than we need to radically change the system, the political system of the state to prevent this from happening again. And it went from, oh, we should, look more deeper into the Switzerland model, where we have this kind of a federated smaller state that is running pretty well through the local governments, up to the point, okay, we really need to look into the anarchist alternatives to the government, and we'll really need to see how we can decentralize the whole way of organizing the society. Currently, the movement was smashed pretty much. There are still a lot of people resisting, but this kind of a big momentum is gone. And most of the people are still trying to resist the police violence and resist repressions. And there are still smaller groups that are organizing actions from time to time. The mobilization potential just dropped massively. If before certain groups like Tikhanovskaya or some big Telegram channels would call for protests and they would be successful in mobilizing certain amount of people, right now this is not working at all. It doesn't matter who is calling people for the demonstrations from Belarus, outside of Belarus, on the streets, outside, in the internet. People are not ready to risk because there is no feeling that there is any kind of a revolutionary momentum happening right now. And maybe this will change in some months, but right now the movement is really gone and people are, in many cases, are really down in their activity. And as I said, one of the main goals is basically like surviving this wave of repressions that everybody's hoping that at some point it will stop. But for now, it's been a year and the repressions are still going and going and going. And they're just dropping like millions and millions of dollars into this kind of repression apparatus, trying to destroy basically like the whole society that can be any kind of independent of the state, starting from like self-organized initiatives, ending up with NGOs and some media channels that are not dependent on Lukashenko and his government. We have pretty much on the daily basis court hearings and people arrested on minor offenses or on bigger charges. The cops are going through the videos that are like 9 months old and still arresting people who were participating in demonstrations back then. And if then they were charging people for some smaller offenses, now they're trying to charge them with bigger things like, going with a flag on the road before was a minor offense. Now they're trying to charge you with some event, some article that would give you up to 3 years in prison. Right. So that is like a general overview of what is happening in the country. And I promise that I'm going to talk about the anarchist movement. We are a little bit over the time. It's 45 minutes talking, 48. But I'm going to talk and talk and talk. So it might be like 1 hour, 20 minutes. Hope you're not going to be angry with me. So anarchist movement. Anarchists in Belarus, before the protests, we exist. For quite some time, Belarusian anarchist movement was not very known to the government, so the cops wouldn't have any understanding what anarchists are, what they're standing for. They would arrest anarchists and then figure out, oh, they are not an opposition members, and so on and so forth. But since 2010, the cops pushed this kind of like a really huge educational program where a lot of cops understand what anarchism is. They read news, they understand what we are standing for, and they created quite a lot of understanding for anarchism and anarchists. And also they created quite a big list of the people they would associate with the anarchist movement through the repressions. So if the person is getting detained at the action that is associated with the anarchists, put on the list of the anarchists, which can be used later on, and so on and so forth. Since 2010, the anarchist movement was working in the underground. Most of the events that were happening, organized by the anarchists, were happening on this kind of like a mouse-to-mouse, or in certain cases, like in the closed social networks. And those things were, well, as in the underground. There was a boom of anarchism between the 2006, 2010, and from 2010, the anarchist movement was trying to struggle with the repressions quite okay, as the government was not capable of, finding the anarchists that they would repress and then everything will be fine. Rather, the movement was recovering after every wave of repression with the new people joining. Before the protests, there were multiple groups organized groups that were preoccupied with different activities, starting with like food not bombs and spreading the food for the people who are in need, and ending up with more specialized groups like ABC Belarus or Premin that are doing their own things. Also, the anarchist movement, through this kind of like repressions that were never stopping since 2010, built up quite a strong solidarity structures. The Belarusian Anarchist Black Cross is like a super strong solidarity organization that is doing a great job. But in general, the anarchist movement in Belarus was relatively small from 2010 and onwards. Relatively small is not like thousands and thousands, but rather like less than 1,000, let's say like that. And the movement was under constant pressure from the political police. The concerts were raided from time to time. If some people would dare to make a public event, they would also get raided, and sometimes people would get preventively arrested before some events and shit like that. So it was before the protest quite a complicated part to be an anarchist in Belarus. However, even that was not stopping a lot of people joining the anarchist movement and like seeing it as one of the few, really dedicated political movements that are fighting against the dictatorship constantly through the new history of the Republic of Belarus. As for what was happening during the protests, anarchists prepared quite all right for the protests, and on the first days of elections, there were quite a lot of different groups, different affinity groups, working here and there and helping people to understand how you can actively participate in the protests, but also by themselves participating in the protest and resisting the police and de-arresting people and stuff like that. And this quite fast influenced it spread quite fast in self-organized groups or on the horizontal level, where this kind of like a, let's say, half mythos of this magical anarchist who can save you from the police appeared, which was not true. I mean, the anarchists were not everywhere, and the people who were de-arresting other people, the chance that they were non-anarchist than anarchist is quite big. But for the people seeing, okay, anarchists are not people who are smashing the windows and burning the cars, which is also completely fine, rather than they're people who are well organized. They are like fighting back the police on the streets, burning some cars and shit like that. And they saw that, and this was like, okay, I want to join anarchists. How I can work together with anarchists to bring down dictatorship. I'm not an anarchist, but I think they are like the best organized group with the clearest ideas what they are doing comparing to the others, which was, as I said, semi-mythos. Some of it is true, some of it is not. As for participation in the Sunday demonstrations, the participation was quite small. In the best times, I think there were like 30, 40 people joining the anarchist bloc. But at the same time, because most of the political groups were not present at those Sunday demonstrations, anarchists were seen by most of the demonstrators as something good. So they were cheering, they were seeing, okay, the anarchists are there, awesome. In some cases, people would actually like crowd around anarchists, seeing it as an organized group that knows what to do again. And in some places, yeah, we were leading the crowds towards the protest in some parts of the city in Minsk. Yeah, and of course, for us, this notion of this, let's say, peaceful protest was not a stop. Like, we didn't believe that we win, and we also didn't believe that, peaceful protest is going to change everything. So there was a lot of attempts to organize beyond that, starting with organizing together with some workers and ending up with some direct actions that people did. For example, there were groups that were smashing video cameras all around Minsk and like promoting this idea, hey, we have to destroy the eyes of the big brother before they figure out who we are. And of course, as anarchists, we understood that, yeah, this is not a perfect, anarchist revolution where people are fighting for anti-authoritarian ideas and destruction of the centralized state, rather than this is like an uprising against the dictatorship that can bring more progressive changes towards the society. So we didn't sit on the couch and said, okay, this is like the bad crowd, we are not going to join them, they are not fighting for our ideals. Rather, we joined the uprising, promoting the radical changes towards the society and finding certain, let's say, ground where people would say, oh yeah, this is really great, this is good. And we have seen like in certain parts, in certain times of this protest, when the anti-authoritarian ideas were on such rise that even like Tikhanovskaya and her liberal surrounding were saying, yeah, we should like look more closer into this decentralization of power, what we are going to do with that, and so on and so forth. I have a small video of the anarchists participating in the demonstration. Yeah, so you can have a look. As for repressions against the anarchist movement, Belarusian state saw anarchists as one of the main targets, as main disruptors of the whole situation. And there were preventive arrests or preventive hunts before the elections. So certain people were already searched. At least one person went into underground, several people left the country, and several people went into underground for sure. So this was happening before, during, and after the arrests of the people on the constant basis. Like, they were searching for the activists constantly. Some people were hiding for months. The other people were still staying at the places where they were working and living with the understanding that they're going to get arrested sooner or later. And as I said, from 2010, cops created quite a massive list of the people they would associate with anarchist movement. And this was quite handy for them to figure out whom to arrest at that point or that point. And they went through that list several times. At some point, the police started using torture during arrest and afterwards. And this became also quite a huge problem for the people, for the anarchist movement, as some people were not ready for such level of escalation. And it is one thing to get arrested and beaten up on the police, but it is the other thing to get raided and tortured for several hours. And the torture is happening still. Like, several people got arrested in August. They were tortured and beaten up. And from one side, some of the cases of torture is some kind of a payback for what is written in the internet or what was done by the anarchists in the matter of last months. But the other torture is done to get access to digital information. So to unlock the encrypted computers, to unlock the smartphones, the cops are torturing people with, like, in some cases, for example, with a plastic bag on the head, and also beating up and pepper spraying and shit like that. There is like a huge variety of what they can do. And they're doing that not only to the anarchists, rather they are doing that to a bigger amount of people who they think are presenting some, let's say, interest. And one of the main, let's say, players in the business of torture is the political police from Gubopik, but also some cops from local like district police stations and shit like that. In the matter of this almost a bit of a year of the protest and afterwards, there were, I think, 16 anarchists and at least 8 antifascists arrested in Belarus. We'll go a little bit step by step through those cases. One of the cases is of this anarchist partisans, as you might have heard. This is 4 people: Dmitry Rizanovich, Igor Alenevich, Sergei Romanov, Dmitry Dubovsky. They are in prison for direct actions. They burned down several, let's say, power structures and cars that belong to the government. And they were charged for that as terrorists. So they are now charged with some terrorist articles that can bring them to really long terms in prison. And they are seen by a lot of people, like, as an example of this, partisan, modern partisan movement in Belarus, even by the liberal groups who are condemning the violence against property, but at the same time see them as really people who dedicated their life to liberate Belarus from dictatorship. Then the cops tried to create some kind of a case of international anarchist criminal organization, where they would include several organizations. Some of them are financing anarchists, the others are doing actions and shit like that, and drop that all together and say, okay, they are like criminal organization. We are going to prosecute all the members of them without, like, we don't give a fuck if they did something or not. They're part of this organization. That's it. So they arrested some of the people who were active before. So, for example, Nikita Dranets, Pavel Shpetny, Alexei Golovko, the people with the stars, they were active in the anarchist movement at some point of their life, most probably. And then the cops came to them and just said, okay, you are an anarchist. We are arresting you as part of this bigger case. While Alexander Kozlyanka is an anarchist from Brest and Andrei Maric is an anti-fascist from Brest, who was like sympathizing anarchists. There are also 3 people arrested in Minsk as part of this international criminal organization case. And they were arrested in August 2020, so just like several weeks of protests happening, and they got picked up by the cops in different parts of the city. With Alexander Franskevich having a star, he's, let's say, problematic anarchist, or some people support him critically with understanding that not everything that he did was, let's say, worth an anarchist, but at the same time, the situation with him is that we should continue support him. He is prosecuted for being an anarchist, for anarchist actions. He was also tortured by the police when he was arrested. And I think if you're interested more in understanding what is like the critical part about him, you can check out the website of Anarchist Black Cross Belarus. There will be a link afterwards. There are several other cases that are not connected to one like big case. One of the cases is Mykola Didok. He's like an anarchist blogger from Belarus who was writing a lot during the protests and before the protests about the police violence, about the government and stuff. And he got quite popular among Telegram bloggers and in general internet Belarusian bloggers. He was in the underground from July till November, and then in November he was arrested at the underground flat where he was tortured for several hours, and then the cops took over all of his like blogging accounts and shit because they tortured him to give till he gave the passwords. So he's now in prison. He's not yet prosecuted. They had like a hiccup in the prosecution process, and they want to drop one more article on him to make a sentence a little bit longer, most probably. Then Alexander Belov and Yevgeny Rubashko were arrested at the same day, and they are now prosecuted for participation in one of the demonstrations that happened, I think, in October or September, and they are charged with like organizing events that are disturbing public peace or something like that, which is like up to 3 years in prison. And Mikita Yemelyanov is a person that was actually arrested before the protests in 2019 for some direct actions in solidarity with already imprisoned comrades. That's pretty much it for today. I still have this awesome slide that you want to help. If you want to help, I hope you want to help. You should help. That's the basic like sympathy part of the whole thing. You should donate a lot, donate all your money that you have, because the struggle costs a lot of money. And if the government is getting money from the people, the only way we can get money right now is through donations, as anarchists, but also as general, like a protest population. Organize solidarity actions with anarchists, but also with people who are imprisoned. It's not only about anarchists, although it is about right now the week of solidarity with anarchist prisoners. Organize actions, do the actions all the time. Let the people know that they are not forgotten, because this is an important part of collective movement, that we are not leaving our comrades in prison and move on with our lives. Learn and spread information. Look at what happened in Belarus. Look at what happened in Hong Kong, what happened in Chile and in other parts where those uprisings were happening against different kinds of power, but at the same time with massive organizing. Learn and try to understand how the political world is working right now. Spread the information. People should be aware of what is happening in Belarus, what is happening in Russia, what is happening in every fucking single country. It can be a little bit more, it can be a little bit too much information, but we are political activists. We are not, people sitting on the couch, switching different channels, and we have to understand the politics and social organizing. Support your local anarchist migrants. There are quite a lot of anarchists who left Belarus in different parts of Europe. Support them in the way that it can be challenging to work with Belarusian anarchists, but it is part of solidarity. Solidarity, nobody said that solidarity is easy. Solidarity is a challenge. Solidarity is a process. So support the people and never give up. And of course, join the anarchists and make revolution. Only together we can change this world to the better place, and only together by going in the direction of the world that is free. Thanks a lot for today. Those are the links that you can follow if you are not following them yet, of some places where you can get updates on from the anarchist perspective, from Belarusian anarchists. Feel free to share, and have a nice day. We'll see you around on the barricades, hopefully.